welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Miguel Cabañas, who is an associate professor of Latin American literature and culture at Michigan State University. He has published 3 articles recently on the war on drugs and how it's portrayed in the media, and he's here to talk to us today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much. Let's
start with the big question here. I mean, is this a war on drugs, and is there any similarity between what we're seeing on TV and in film with what's really going on?
So the war on drugs, it used to be a metaphor, right? So it was invented as a metaphor during Richard Nixon's presidency.
Oh, it goes back that far.
It goes back far,
I associate this with Ronald Reagan's era.
No, this is earlier.
Of course, Nixon's war was against marijuana, I think, right? It was an LSD.
Yeah, about everything, right?
Yeah.
Mostly about the people who smoked marijuana.
Right.
People who did LSD, but it was a metaphor. Some of his the things that he did, he invested in creating programs for people with drug problems, et cetera, et cetera. It's the Reagan years where it really becomes a real war. A war that is about militarization, about expanding into Latin America, into later will be the Kingpin Initiative strategy, what they call it. And it becomes a real war where now there's been more than 345,000 deaths, homicides in Mexico related to the war on drugs, and more than 100 disappeared. Just 1/3 of the disappeared in Argentina. So we're talking about devastating consequences of a war that has been going on for more than 50 years plus.
And this isn't a war with just 2 parties here. This is governments against groups that are dealing in drugs, and those groups then also fighting against one another, I understand, right?
Right. And also, it has created, this prohibition. We know that prohibition didn't work in the U.S. Prohibition at a global level is not going to work either, but it has created more violence, between cartels or groups, criminal groups that are looking for protection, that are trying to make it in the business, and things have been getting worse and worse. Also, the corruption issues. The military in Mexico. We know that they've given drug traffickers heavy artillery and things like that. So things that are escalating, and it is a real war. It's in other wars, there's fewer deaths than in this one.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, roughly, is this being portrayed accurately in any of the films or the TV shows that we're seeing?
Well, accuracy is not what those shows are about.
Of course,
I think, I think we can learn a lot from the shows and what people are thinking and different meanings of the war for different people. But those are coded. Some of the films that we watch in the U.S. are very much coded for the prohibition script,
right?
To make us think that the war, this failed war that 50 years plus, after $1 trillion spending in this, I think I could do
$1 trillion,
something.
Really? Yeah.
I think we could do something with $1 trillion in terms of education and other programs, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It's a war that basically has gotten us some people in jail, but the amount of drugs keep coming in the country. There's no, the criminal organizations keep growing and keep participating in this business.
Well, let's look at the war on drugs first here, and then we can get into more detail on the portrayals of it. So let's talk about Colombia. What does this look like in Colombia? What's the nature of this?
Well, in Colombia, it was very interesting because it was related to the guerrilla movements there, right? So the Colombia, or the Plan Colombia, what they called, it was to provide the military and assistance to fight against the cartels, but really it was really to fight the guerrilla movements in Colombia. So that was successful, but the drugs keep coming from Colombia anyway. The DA claims that we got rid of Pablo Escobar, the Medellin cartel, we got rid of the Cali cartel, but the drugs keep coming anyway. So it's not. I mean, the failed war is clear that it's not getting us anywhere.
And this is a particularly violent scene here because of the guerrilla warfare that it grew out of, right?
Right. So the guerrilla warfare and the guerrilla group, the FARC, were involved also in maintaining the drug war. Why? Because they needed money, right? They needed funding.
Yeah.
And so they got involved in some ways. But it was a total mess because the paramilitary was also involved, and they were basically vigilante groups helping the army. So there was a whole mess of violence that luckily has changed since the accords with the FARC.
Is there any general explanation for why this has continued and it hasn't been nobody's been able to put a stop to it in Colombia?
In Colombia?
Yeah. It's probably the same anywhere, but starting with Colombia.
Well, Colombia, I mean, I think, drugs, create a lot of wealth. And, Colombia has had a lot of problems with income inequality. So that creates the
So when someone sees that the drug lord's been eliminated, it's just very tempting for someone else to step in. And
somebody else can step in or take, or go to a different area or switch the transportation.
Now, things are a little different in Mexico because Mexico also functions as sort of the transit nation here, right? The drugs come through Mexico often, right?
Right. So what happens is the U.S. closed the entrance in Florida, in Miami, and it created what they called.
So Miami was the main
hub, right?
During what period?
In the 80s.
In the 80s.
In the 80s and early 90s. So
Yeah.
once that hub was closed, it created what they call the whack-a-mole effect, right? So when you hit you whack the mall appears somewhere else, right?
Yeah,
So Mexico became the area where most of the drugs will come in. And so then the cartels or the criminal groups that were, kind of in the shadows of the Colombian businesses, they became main players. And so that's what we're living right now, basically the changes that brought up by that.
Why were we able to shut things down in Florida, but not necessarily in Mexico?
Well, have you seen how long the border is? The border between the U.S. and Mexico.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a river. Sometimes it's basically El Chapo created tunnels that will go underneath. That go underneath the border.
Yeah, I've heard about the length of these tunnels. They're tremendous. They're very long. Yeah. Well, so you have some of the same problem in Mexico that you have in Colombia. Plus, there's this issue of they're transporting things and moving things into the United States. And then what's this look like in the United States? How's the United States drug traffic different from what it's like in the countries that are feeding it in?
Well, in the U.S., it's more localized. A lot of the time, it's transported to different hubs, basically, and then distributed.
Yeah.
The main hubs being Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York.
Yeah. It's interesting. Chicago's in the middle of the country here, and you feel like we're far removed from all these things.
It's part of the border.
But it's part of the border, and also we've got O'Hare Airport, right?
Yeah.
Which is
right.
Which connects us to a lot of things.
And just remember, what people sometimes don't think is that NAFTA was one of the main innovations for drug traffickers.
Oh, really?
Because that created that, the possibility of transport. Most of the drugs are transported in legal transportation.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And
For instance?
Big boats.
So my car was assembled in Mexico. Is it possible that some drugs came across? Should I look around? Should I?
You could
open
look
up some
around,
panels?
but
Yeah.
it's probably not in
Yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
they have semis. You can put
Yeah.
a lot in a semi. You can border patrol, corruption is been pretty high in the last 20 years.
On our side.
On our side.
Really?
Yeah. And so it's basically a.
So a border guard is making $50,000 a year,
Right.
to be generous, and what kind of a bribe would that person get potentially?
Potentially could get 400,000 in just a month.
Wow.
So why not, right?
Yeah.
So the war on drugs create these problems, right? Where there's so much money that can be made. Prohibition brings the money, and the risk brings the possibilities.
So well, let's shift to the portrayal of this in film and on television. What are some that some portrayals that you think are relatively accurate? Actually, let's start with the Traffic movie that came out in the United States around 2000, I think. That was presented as if it were like the first real hard look at this issue, and it showed layers of activity going on, layers of corruption and things.
Right.
What's your take on that film?
So that film is very interesting because I think it tries to give a full view of the whole thing. We see from the drug dealer to the junkie to the drug czar, right? We have the Michael Douglas character, and his daughter is an addict, and all this whole thing, kind of breaking it down. We also have the background corruption case of General Rebollo, which was a very famous one. That interestingly enough,
So it was based on some
it was
true
based
story.
on real story. General Rebollo was the czar in Mexico. He was supposedly was cleaning up the drug traffickers, and it turns out that no, he was actually working for them.
Right.
We have the same case in 2023 of Genaro Garcia Luna, who he was just committed to the crime. So it's interesting. That film is interesting because it also seems like it's going to be repeated in going in circles. But I think what's interesting in that film is that it makes us, especially for the white audience, it makes them squirm. It makes them think this
could happen to you.
This could happen to anybody. If it can happen to the czar drug, to the drug czar, it could happen to my daughter. It could happen to
Those scenes are very compelling.
Right.
I mean, it just shows these high school kids sitting around innocently with
just
this
doing
pipe,
drugs. Doing drugs, and so basically. It
and not realizing they're becoming addicted, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and so that it goes very much with the state ideology of prohibition, right? We need to do something because this is going to kill us all, right? And it creates a sense of an emotional response directly.
Do you think they've got an agenda when they make these films? What do you think?
I think some of these films have been, we know that Hollywood sometimes gets funding and permissions from the Pentagon or the DEA or so. We know that sometimes the state promotes a certain agenda, but I think it represents what people thought at the time. I think that people were very much drugs were a bad word. You
Yeah.
don't want to talk about drugs near you, right?
Yeah.
This paranoia of and
So there's some truth to it. It's something that could affect any of us.
right,
But the implication is that it will affect all of us, right? I mean,
right,
it extends it.
right.
Yeah.
It will destroy American society,
Yeah.
basically.
It's interesting from looking at this from the standpoint of film and television. This is a theme in a lot of film and television since the 1950s, when we started having these, seeing these shows about invaders from Mars, or
Yep.
plant life that's going to take over
Yep.
the planet. And I remember one of the famous lines from the end of one of the movies was, "Keep watching the skies, keep watching the skies," because these aliens are going to come
Right.
take us all over. So it seems like we're getting this message over and over again that
Yeah.
life as we know it is going to change, and we
Right.
need to be afraid.
Right, and that fear is what has fueled this war,
Yeah.
basically. That is fueled that people don't question the war on drugs. They don't
Yeah.
question how horrible the consequences are for we have 2 million people incarcerated.
Yeah.
In this country.
So we're saying that on the one hand, there's the influx of drugs is a problem, but the war on drugs is also another problem then.
I'm saying the war on drugs is the problem.
It's the bigger problem.
It's the bigger problem.
Okay.
Because basically prohibition, we know that it doesn't work, and the U.S.
Right.
knows that it doesn't work,
Right.
and yet we want to enact it. Now the question is, why do we keep doing the same, thinking that it's going to be different?
Right. There's
I-
also a hypocrisy at the basis of that, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
why are we outlawing the drugs? Because you don't want them to hurt people, right? So once someone gets hurt by these drugs and they end up buying and selling them to maintain their habit,
Right.
we catch them and throw them in jail and punish them,
Right.
right?
Right.
So, I mean, do we feel like they're victims or not? And if they're not victims, then why are we policing it?
Right, and so there is that hypocrisy that you mentioned is very
Yeah.
much so, but at the same time we know that there's certain corporations that are getting rich out of this war. Those $1 trillion are going to weapons manufacturers,
Yeah.
helicopter manufacturers,
Yeah.
surveillance manufacturers. All those are the winners of this war. We are the losers. We are, we don't have good health care. We don't have good, clean schools. We don't have, things like that.
And money could be spent in ways that might help people
Correct.
avoid the temptation of drugs.
Correct.
So getting back to how this is portrayed, I mean, has that perspective come out at all, do you think?
Well, so the way I look at it, I think the war on drugs is portrayed in different ways. Obviously, it's usually not accurate. Why? Because it's a secret war.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what happens behind. We don't
that's
know
true.
what the DA does.
Everything
we
we
don't
know-
know
yeah.
what has happened.
Everything comes from watching TV.
Correct.
then.
So it's a media war, right? Those are media wars that we get the information from other sources. Now, how do we know that is accurate? We don't know. So I feel like that's it's very convenient, for example, for the U.S. to always point the corruption on Mexico or Colombia,
Right.
or to Latin America, but it's not convenient for the DEA to say, how many agents have been corrupted, and we had to let them go.
Well, I wanted to get back to that because that's also been a theme in the film industry when they cover things like this. And I think of the Raul Julia role in Tequila Sunrise. And he's I think he's supposed to be the Mexican official who's overseeing this crackdown on drugs, and he comes and he visits Mel Gibson, who's his friend, and they smoke marijuana, and Gibson finds out that Raul Julia is actually smuggling drugs in while they're talking and having dinner. So the plot is that the person who we think is our friend is actually the enemy, and they're actually using this against us. And you've just given us several examples of people who we thought were working against the transportation of drugs, and actually were actually employed in the industry, essentially.
Yeah. And, for example, there's a case of, it's called Allende. It's a little town in Mexico that was exterminated by the drug lords because the DEA gave a tip to somebody, kind of like Genaro Garcia Luna type, who was corrupt. And they exterminated the whole town. It's actually portrayed in there's a 2017 article by ProPublica, but also it was represented in a Netflix show called Somos, We Are.
So we are getting some actual representation of what's going on in a lot of this, right? But I think what you're saying is we're not getting the big picture.
We're not getting the big picture because it's a secret war, and there's no accountability for the people in countries like Colombia, Mexico, and there's no accountability for the.
So one of the obvious ways to resolve this would be to legalize all of these drugs, to back away from prohibition. What do you think about that?
I think a lot of countries are going that way. I think it's if many scientists have been saying that if you actually legalize it, you can actually control better that the substance are what they are. They're not adulterated by dealers, or so it becomes safer in a way for people to do. If they want to do drugs, I don't do drugs, but if people want to do drugs, they should be able to do it. In the same way that we drink alcohol or do other things that are not as good for us. But
of all of these shows that are going on now, Narcos and Escobar the Drug Lord, El Capo, what ones do you think are the most revealing and the most interesting?
Well, I think Narcos is very interesting, actually. So there's Narcos and Narcos Mexico. Narcos tries to kind of give an overall history of drug trafficking, first in Colombia and then in Mexico. Kind of a history. And it's obviously the perspective is the DEA, right? So the people who kind of told the story, who is the DEA agents, but they reveal interesting things about the war on drugs, because at certain moments they realize that they're not doing what they want to do,
and they expose that.
They expose it, and I think it's a very telling. Even though they present drug traffickers as monsters and they are the heroes and et cetera, I think there's a certain amount of truth that comes out when they realize that what they're doing is not doing much.
Right.
It's failing in some ways, and I think it's at the end of Javier Peña, Pascal is the actor. He resigns basically because he thought that by killing Escobar things were going to be done. And so he did all these illegal things in Colombia to get him killed. And then he realizes, well, but there's the cartel in Cali now, and now they're going to control the drugs, and there is going to continue. So I find that an interesting depiction of the war on drugs, and kind of a historical, but
interesting that conclusion is somewhat similar to the conclusion in traffic, right? The person in charge ends up resigning. It's almost saying finally,
Right.
we really can't control this.
I think those moments, even though the narrative develops that prohibition, we need to do prohibition. There's those moments where there is some honesty in some ways where they see, no, that's not going to do it.
This isn't working.
It's not going to work.
Very good. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Miguel Cabañas for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.